Roger Mantie joins us from the University of Toronto Scarborough in Canada, and his talk, as you can see, is titled Reclaiming the Eudaimonic Potential of Leisure Time Music Making. Roger, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Gareth and Marissa, for helping to organize this and adapting to the circumstances and everything else, and to everyone else who's tuned in and joining. It really is great. Obviously, not as good perhaps as being in person, but we'll make do, right? So this little paper I'm going to read here is an excerpt from a chapter from a book that I might finish one day, hopefully. It's been a few years. We'll see. So hopefully it will still make sense, the fact that I've kind of extracted it. If it doesn't make sense, just know that you know, if and when you get the chance to read the whole chapter, then it will make perfect sense. So we'll do our best here. So I've entitled this Reclaiming the Eudaimonic Potential of Leisure Time Music Making. So here we go. In 2013, the United Nations established March 20th as the International Day of Happiness. Not surprisingly, it didn't receive quite as much attention this year as it sometimes does. So while only a symbolic gesture like other quote unquote international days, that the UN felt it important enough to recognize happiness with a special day does send a message. Has 21st century life become so joyless that we need to reserve a day to remind us about the importance of happiness? Has happiness become so rarefied that we need to recognize it like other ritualized once-a-year celebrations such as Mother's Day in order to ensure important values aren't forgotten? Isn't happiness something we should be aiming for every single day of our lives? The idea of leisure, a domain in life with the potential to increase personal and collective happiness and well-being, has receded from public concern, at least as assessed by the paucity of mention it receives outside of the quote-unquote so-called leisure industry, a sector that has little to do with classical conceptions of leisure. This, for me, is regrettable, as connections between classical leisure, what is sometimes described in the leisure studies field as schole, and happiness have a very long history, flowing from ancient Greek thought that was seemingly obsessed with the problem of how to live a good, which is to say a happy life. Happiness for the Greeks being, as those of us at this conference well know, something more complicated than just having a laugh. On what basis or bases does one make choices about how to live life well in the face of various alternatives? Does one live in and for the moment, or delay gratification for the promise of greater payoff down the road? Does one live only or primarily for oneself, or do obligations to others play a role in good living? Is living life more about a hedonic sense of maximizing pleasures and reducing pains, or about the eudaimonic sense of developing one's capacities to their fullest? That the World Leisure Journal dedicated a special issue to the relationship between leisure and happiness as recently as 2016 suggests that we have not gotten that much closer to solving the ancient problem of how to live. Leisure, like other domains of life, involves choices, which raises the question of how to choose. Do I read a book, go for a run, or make music? And if make music, the music maker asks, shall it be Bach, Brubeck, Cardi B, or Bhangra? Living well, it turns out, is rather complicated. As Bob Robertson summarizes, the two basic conceptions of happiness traced to the ancient Greeks are hedonic, concerned primarily with pleasure, and eudaimonic, concerned primarily with virtue and the realization of who one can and should become. Quote, the former might arise from attending a symphony, while the latter might arise from playing an instrument well in an orchestra, end quote. Perhaps this is an assertion we might want to discuss here after the talk. This is all somewhat reductionist, of course, as there are many differences, both nuanced and fundamental, between various ancient Greek thinkers who wrote about hedonism and eudaimonia. At heart, however, these two conceptions, hedonism and eudaimonia, continue to provide a useful framework for understandings of how leisure, and in particular for my purposes, musical leisure, might figure in response to the question of how to live. Now, I should pause here to just kind of acknowledge that there are, I mean, all people involved in this conference and others who have written on many of the kind of niceties of eudaimonia and whatnot. My complete chapter involves a discussion of well-being, quality of life, the right and the good, etc., and a fuller discussion of hedonism, which might have been useful here. But I've reduced it to one paragraph, so I hope that you can bear with it here. So, for many people today, hedonism likely conjures up Dionysus or Bacchus, or perhaps the carefree, irresponsible lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In Pleasure and the Good Life, concerning the nature, varieties, and plausibility of hedonism, Fred Feldman sets out to offer a theory that defends hedonism as the basis of the good life. Feldman is quick to acknowledge that in the everyday world, hedonism is often associated with that which is vulgar or risque. This association is hardly new, dating back to Epicurus, an early proponent of a more ascetic and restrained version of hedonism. Epicurus was apparently greatly disturbed by the equation of pleasure with self-indulgence. Among philosophers, then, hedonism is simply a theory that advances pleasure as what makes for a good life. Given music's obvious connections with the general idea of pleasure, it seems prudent to consider not just the possibilities of eudaimonia, but also musical pleasure in connection to the good life. One is left to ask where pleasure and eudaimonianism are to be found within the context of today's daily living. The classic answer supplies three domains: family, work, and leisure. Family does continue to provide a basis for pleasure and flourishing for many people. Problematically, however, family structures vary from circumstance to circumstance, and there are typically few options involved. Beyond the selection of a life partner and the decision to have children, one does not choose one's family typically. One doesn't choose one's parents or siblings or relatives. One might experience pleasure or flourishing as a parent or partner, but where does this leave the childless or the partnerless? When pleasure and happiness are to be found in work and career, many people have a reasonable chance of living the good life. This is no doubt true for many in the professional class, such as university professors. Many of us live for our work. It is a calling, to put it in Lutheran terms. It seems unreasonable, however, to believe that all people find the good life through their work. It seems perverse to suggest that someone's calling is to scrub toilets or serve French fries for minimum wage under terrible working conditions, for example. Work as the good life is also problematic when we think of those who do not or cannot work. Where then are pleasure and happiness to be found for people who cannot attain the good life through work or through family? Despite its many potential problems, leisure provides an ideal towards which to aim for the good life, one that is, at least in theory, available to almost all people regardless of work or other circumstances. According to leisure scholar Rob Stebbins, leisure is essentially hedonic. I take this to mean that leisure is about pursuing personal welfare, which is not to overlook or dismiss the altruistic intentions that motivate activity like volunteerism. This is to say that leisure ideally represents a seeking rather than an obligation. Excuse me. In this sense, leisure can be understood as a fundamentally ethical endeavor. As Hayden Ramsey explains, classifying ethics as seeking the good life and morality as seeking the obligated, quote, makes it possible to identify leisure, an activity in which we are very much at ease and self-sufficient, as a central ethical activity, end quote. Somewhat surprising to me is that many of the philosophers who discuss the good life, spend relatively little time discussing the problem of upbringing, particularly in relation to education and child rearing. Now, Aristotle and Paideia are obviously an exception to this. The good and the good life are often treated as if knowledge of them is self-evident or born of some sort of immaculate conception. The question here is how people come to understand the good life. For if we are not to lapse into the nihilism of total determinism, we must grant the possibility for agency. And yet, it cannot be denied that agency is, at least in part, a reflection of history and socialization. To this point, people are more likely to seek leisure if people understand it and understand it as possible and desirable. If, in other words, leisure awareness is part of people's development in the sense of upbringing during one's formative years. This is to say that if leisure, understood as personal welfare, is connected in some way with happiness and well-being, i.e. the good life, and if leisure is understood as a right to seek, the cumulative societal effect on human flourishing can be dramatic. If music were to be considered virtuous in a modern version of the Greek arete, rather than avirtuous, example being as a school subject to be learned because music is somehow nebulously basic to education or because students will have so-called aesthetic experiences, music making throughout life could be conceptualized as an important part of the good life, understood as ethical, hedonic, or eudaimonic seeking. Music making in such a conceptualization would still involve, at least in the early years of life, such things as training and excellence, but in the sense of developing capacities and striving, not in the sense of obedience or winning. Importantly, all instruction and all learning would be premised upon music education as leisure education, where leisure is understood not as activity for activity's sake, but as engagement as part of the art of living. One would not learn music because music is good for you, but because it is good to do music, not just during the formative years, but throughout one's life. Put differently, music learning as part of paideia, understood here as leisure education, would see young people learn that it is right to make music because music making is good for personal and collective welfare. As Max Kaplan concludes, oh, sorry, left out that one. As Max Kaplan concludes, leisure understood in this way is about the building back of purpose into life rather than the mere enjoying of life. It is worth taking Kaplan's point to heart, if for no other reason than the hedonic treadmill effect, where happiness tends to exhibit something of a regression to the mean. That is, studies in psychology have shown that in one sense, people maintain a baseline of happiness regardless of external events, positive or negative. To take a somewhat convoluted example, if one's enjoyment of music making arises primarily from the applause one receives, the positive effect of the applause will tend to moderate over time, requiring a person to seek out bigger and bigger audiences in order to achieve the same level of satisfaction. Applause seeking may be hedonic, but it is not purposeful. It is not an ethical seeking. Whereas if, on the other hand, one makes music not for the external affirmation, but because one enjoys the activity as part of an overall concern for healthy living, applause becomes ancillary. By way of comparison, I enjoy playing the game of squash, or rather, I used to prior to the pandemic. But my enjoyment of squash is not dependent on whether I win or lose. I enjoy the excitement of the game, especially if my partner and I are evenly matched, and I take enjoyment in believing that I am taking care of my physical health by maintaining an active lifestyle. Importantly, however, I do not just play squash or make music for the enjoyment, but because I believe these are purposeful activities as part of an overall practice in the art of living. It could be argued that trying to resuscitate paideia and eudaimonia is simply a case of old wine in new bottles, and that such antiquated concepts are better eschewed in favor of modern terms such as Maslow's self-actualization or concepts in positive psychology, the PERMA, the six-factor model, etc. I don't really agree. Seeking the good life is not the kind of quest like that for self-actualization that can be achieved because it isn't about arrival or finding something predetermined from the outset. Purpose and meaning are not a priori. They emerge through ethical enactment. Importantly, paideia and eudaimonia, at least in a contemporary context, recognize that life often gets in the way. For the vast majority of people, hedonic seeking is part of life but not the whole of it. As leisure studies scholar Martin Davies puts it, leisure is valuable because it enables us to conjecture a way we would like to be, another way of being, but a way in which we can never totally be. I don't believe Davies means this in a fantasy escapist way, but in a way that celebrates leisure as optimistic possibility in the face of life with obligations, responsibilities, and obstacles. When freedom of choice to pursue what we want to pursue presents itself, what do we choose to do? As an educator or parent, how do I create affordances for others to exercise leisure options, especially those understood to the best of our collective knowledge to be fundamentally good? There are, of course, potential problems with hedonic or eudaimonic conceptions of leisure seeking. Most obvious is the problem of how one might distinguish virtuous from non-virtuous activity. In terms of hedonism, how does one avoid what is sometimes called solipsistic pleasure, or determine what Feldman describes as properly directed pleasure? In Principia Ethica, G.E. Moore claims, following J.S. Mill's idea of higher pleasures, that some objects, such as reading, are worthy objects of pleasure, whereas others, such as torturing animals, are not, conveniently overlooking perhaps how the banning of books or cultural imperialism might square with any universal conception of good and bad objects of pleasure. Similarly, Stephen Darwell suggests, without actually mentioning how merit might be determined, that, quote, we flourish through meritorious activities such as parenting and music making, thought it was kind of convenient, because these activities involve an appreciation of things that matter, things with worth. One always hopes that pleasure and enjoyment, in the sense of Aristotle's supervenience, will occur through leisure music making. But this pleasure and enjoyment can never be guaranteed in advance. In part, this is because leisure satisfactions through music making reflect history, culture, and context. Some pleasures likely are better than other pleasures, and some activities in music likely are better objects of pleasure than others. Excellence can lapse into unhealthy obsession and competition, for example. Problems with determining virtuous activity notwithstanding, I would suggest that the problem of the good life is the problem of leisure. To the extent that it is available to all people, leisure is a socially just site for eudaimonia in contemporary society. To the extent we have allowed leisure to disappear from our concerns, we have allowed the good life as a goal to disappear from our concerns. Just learning music for the sake of learning music because it is assumed to be good for us in the way that eating fruits and vegetables are good for us is, I would suggest, a regrettable educational stance. To engage with music making as leisure is to engage as part of a seeking that recognizes a conception of the good life, whatever it may be. And I think I will leave it